Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to welcome those of you that are on the call. Thank you for joining us for this healthcare industry lunch and learn webinar series. Today, we're going to cover HIPAA and cybersecurity, share some practical steps that you can take now in your organizations to protect your organizations from a data privacy and security perspective. And I'll go ahead and just say a few words about the agenda today. We're going to have a brief introduction, talk about recent developments in cybersecurity, and provide some context, talk about today's threat environment. I'm going to share some HIPAA privacy tips. Andy Jones from Fortress is going to share security considerations. My partner, Brandon Powley, will talk about incidents response. And I know that I've worked with him on several breach responses, and he does a great job with his team. Kyle is going to cover post-incident litigation. And then we're going to have a little bit of an open discussion. So the presentation should run approximately a half an hour or so, and then there will hopefully be some time for some Q&A after that. And if the participants don't mind just going ahead and muting on your end, that would be great, just to kind of help mitigate the background noise. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to my partner, Brandon.
Thank you, Kate. Everybody, I'm Brandon Pauly. I am with Brennan Manna Diamond's Columbus office. And I wanted to introduce our guest today, Andy Jones. He is the CEO of Fortress. And Fortress is a division of MCPC. It's based in Cleveland, Ohio, and provides a suite of IT and cybersecurity services to businesses spanning all sorts of industries, and including healthcare is relevant to today. It's a real treat for us and for everybody that's on the call to have Andy with us. I've spoken with Andy and seen him work, and I don't think there's somebody that has any more passion or just a real energy about cybersecurity. So with that, I'll let Andy describe a little bit about his background and then ultimately his company, Fortress.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you guys for using my pre-pandemic picture. I very much appreciate that. It's been a long, hard slog. As I was introduced, Andy Jones, CEO here at Fortress. Our primary purpose, the only reason that Fortress exists, is to help organizations, frankly, protect themselves from the ravages of cybercrime, all kinds of cybercrime, whether it's nation-state sponsored cyber terrorism, which we'll probably talk a little bit about that. It could be your run-of-the-mill organized crime, or it could just be the bottom feeders that are doing phishing and spear phishing, and we'll talk about all of that. But we help organizations protect themselves and create a more resilient environment so that they protect their data, and in the case of healthcare, protect their clients, those patients, and the types of information that you house on them. So we offer services, to Brendan's point, we offer services from one extreme of the spectrum to the other, whether it's the initial upfront kind of consultancy and assessment services through incident response and breach work. We do quite a bit of breach work. And then a bevy of services to do the ongoing care and feeding and continuous monitoring and prevention of those cyber attacks, or limit the success of those cyber attacks and environments. So thank you, Brandon.
Thanks, Andy. Next slide, Kate. So just to provide a baseline for everybody that's on the call, and understanding that there might be a scale of I guess, knowledge and interest in how cybersecurity will impact you or your organization, setting the table for why this is important and what the cyber threat landscape is for United States businesses, for your business, and specifically healthcare businesses. You might hear the term new normal being thrown around. It seemed like in the US, at least, with the pipeline issue that was, about a year, 14 months ago, that was sort of an inflection point for the US population's, I guess, knowledge and really taking cybersecurity as a real threat to businesses and individuals here in the United States. And this new normal brings with it different types of considerations that you may have to take in operating your business. Healthcare specifically is a target. Data and specifically personal sensitive data like social security numbers, credit card information, biometric data, that is currency on the black market for hackers and threat actors that look to penetrate and steal that data because it is their currency. They can trade it on the black market on, if you've heard the dark web, the dark internet, they trade it for money, and that's how they sustain their business. So healthcare specifically, organizations hold a bevy, it's almost like a honeypot of data for these bad actors to supplement their own incomes. Today, specifically, and if you pay attention to the news and you watch any sort of news channel right now, you see all sorts of commercials about cybersecurity. Commercials and ads you may not have seen even 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago. And part of that reason is the American industry recognizes that there's a new age warfare. And specifically, as you see with Russia and Ukraine, there are alerts weekly, if not daily, coming from the White House, coming from governmental organizations regarding threats to companies and their data. It's not just the public sector, it's also the private sector now. And recently, I believe 2 or 3 weeks ago, the White House even set out a list of considerations that companies should take in protecting their data and looking at their cybersecurity. And on top of the nation state threats that are out there, you also have insider threats. You need to worry about your folks. As the workplace has moved to a remote workplace, you have different types of connections and different types of accesses that you need to consider when developing your IT framework and your cybersecurity posture. And then ultimately, there's always going to be hackers. Everybody's probably heard of Anonymous. There are activist hackers. And yes, people praise them when their target is on the Russian government and stealing that information. But if the ire is turned towards your organization for whatever reason, it's not as funny and cheered as much. So with that, I'll let Andy add his insight on the current cyber threat landscape.
Yeah, thanks again, Brennan. I will tell you that for us, we've seen just an explosion in attacks, and attack vectors, and attacks, whether they're nation state sponsored or otherwise, over the last couple of years, especially the last several weeks with what's going on in Ukraine. Healthcare specifically, a big chunk of our clientele is healthcare based, just given the nature of the types of information that healthcare providers or healthcare organizations tend to house on the black market, on the dark web, as you suggested. A healthcare record's worth about 20 times today what a financial record is worth, just because of the richness of the data, the ability to. That data record can be used for a myriad of things, whether it's just good old fashioned basic, let me create and defraud someone out of a credit card. But with the richness of the healthcare information, we see it used pretty heavily for Medicaid, Medicare fraud, or really any other types of fraud, including mortgages and whatnot. I'm sure if you've been watching the news recently, there's a few $1 billion that is thought to be missing as a result of some of the COVID financial plans that came out of DC over the last 2 years. A good portion of those ability to defraud them or create fraudulent receipts is by harvesting this type of information or claiming this type of information. So healthcare as a sector continues to be a very, very large target. It doesn't matter if you're Cleveland Clinic, or if you're a small regional or even local city-based clinic. All of your information is of great value. And it really depends on who the attacks are coming from. I think there's a common misperception or a misconception in the world that everyone that's attacking you has a hoodie, as we depict here in the iconography. Much of the attacks that are happening today, especially in the healthcare arena, these are not necessarily activist hackers that are coming after your healthcare system. It generally, we don't see Russia playing an active role today in healthcare. They have picked up the pace quite a bit in the last few years around critical infrastructure, which of course healthcare is a part of, but their attacks seem to be a bit more targeted at the energy sector and the defense sector, Russia specifically, although we are seeing them branch now more into manufacturing and healthcare. But those attacks, whether they're nation state sponsored or frankly more often than not here domestically, I hate to say it, it's just good old fashioned organized crime. Much of the way the mafia operated 5-7 years ago has changed pretty heavily. This is in their mind, it's a victimless crime. It requires only one or two very capable technical experts to get to grift a huge amount of money. And one of the fastest growing segments, and again, this is where the types of information that healthcare organizations have access to, is elder fraud. We see this growing by leaps and bounds right now. And we can go into some more, if there are questions, we can go into a lot more detail on who attacks and why they attack. But healthcare seems to be a big target and continues to be a big target.
Thank you, Andy. Why is it important to engage experts then? Why not just do this yourself? Well, the consequences of data breaches and security incidents are vast. They range from the loss of trust, public trust with your patients and other consumers. The financial losses are a pretty direct result of this, not only from, in the case of ransomware, if your systems get locked up, you are unable to conduct business. You're losing that revenue from the hours, days, weeks that your systems are down and you are unable to conduct business. But also on the back end, dealing with specific to healthcare, OCR investigations, possible fines and penalties. And those stem from, generally it's a sliding scale, and there are mitigating factors when it comes to how much you are penalized and how much you are fined. And OCR really does look at what steps and how did you try and prepare for what we know to be active threats to the data that you hold. And part of that comes in with having procedures and policies, training your employees in your organization, and having folks like Fortress and Andy come in and do threat assessments and penetration tests so you can understand where your vulnerabilities are. It's amazing in dealing with clients and understanding if some clients just don't know A, what data they have, and B, where it's at. That lack of knowledge ultimately results in more dire consequences in the event, which is becoming more likely of an event, that you are subject to a breach or a security incident. So Andy, I'm sure you have war stories on how the consequences impact and affect your clients.
Yeah, I'm going to give you this is fairly new data. It's the last couple of weeks. We used to cite a statistic a year ago, and it's been pretty consistent for the last few years. For organizations that have had a security incident, whether it was an incident or a breach, really was irrelevant. But if they had a security incident, a little over 50% of those organizations would be reinfected or have another incident within a year. The sad thing is that in more than half of those that were re-victimized, more than half of those that were re-victimized by the same organization that victimized them to begin with. Now that's a little bit older data. The data that is now coming out, and it's again fairly new, organizations that tend to do their own cleanup, if you will, it's more like 80% wind up being reinfected or re-encrypted within a year's time frame. So I would encourage you, if I mean, you're all in healthcare in some way, shape, or form. If you have a cardiac moment and you start feeling better a few days later because you rested at home, that's not the time to ignore those symptoms. I would encourage you to, no different than you would seek out a cardiologist, I would encourage you to seek out a skilled set of cyber experts and have them look. More often than not, organizations, there's this belief that somebody clicked on an email and that clicking on the email spawned this whole set of reactions. Usually that's not the case. Most environments, the bad actors have been in the environment lurking and looking and quantifying what information you have and where it's at for, I think the last average I saw was about 270, 275 days. So yes, occasionally somebody accidentally clicks on something and creates a tidal wave, but more often than not, that click starts a small tidal wave that's a little bit of a distraction to allow them to insert malware into the environment and start mining and harvesting, whether it's credentials or data or what have you. They're very gifted at delayed gratification these days. And we've seen a huge strategy change there over the last 5-7 years. So definitely seek some expert advice.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to just cover HIPAA privacy for a brief moment. So when we refer to HIPAA, we're really talking about the privacy rule, security rule, and breach notification rule. So my co-presenters here are going to talk a little about the security rule and the breach notification rule in further depth. I'm going to share just a handful of practical tips with respect to privacy. And the privacy rule is obviously not anything new. I think it's been a significant part of my practice. I've been working with HIPAA daily since 2002, just in my own practice. But it's always good to be reminded of what the requirements are. As questions come up, I'm sure that those of you on the call have learned that there are excellent materials on the Office of Civil Rights website, excellent frequently asked questions. But it's also really important to remember that HIPAA sets a minimum floor for privacy. And so what that means is that other state laws and federal laws that are more stringent do apply. And if you ever need help issue spotting, feel free to call me anytime offline, and we can kind of help identify other laws that need to be considered as well. But again, HIPAA is just a minimum floor. One of the first steps to any HIPAA analysis from a privacy perspective is kind of understanding what hat you're wearing. So HIPAA covered entities are health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and healthcare providers, but only those healthcare providers that typically bill for services electronically. That means that my plastic surgery groups, those clients, or some of my digital health clients that bill patients cash, they don't bill third-party payers. They're not technically subject to HIPAA, although I will say most of them comply with HIPAA as a best practice. So that's really important to remember. I think many of you on the call, though, are actually probably subject to HIPAA because you're HIPAA business associates. And it's important to kind of understand the distinction as we navigate what your actual duties are under the privacy rule. Either by way of the text itself and the regulations, or under the HIPAA Business Associate Agreement. Let's see, a couple other things I just wanted to throw out there. And I think some of you have heard me say this before, but I really can't overemphasize the importance of being prepared on the front end, having those policies and procedures in place that actually reflect what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, that aren't a binder that's dusty on the shelf. As Brandon and I know, we've been working on a very significant HIPAA breach response together, and OCR is going to ask for your HIPAA policies and procedures, and they're going to want to know that you actually complied with them. So having policies and procedures that you don't comply with is a bad look for sure. And take the time to put training in place with respect to the privacy rule, what can and can't be done. Make sure that workforce training is simple enough to be remembered by the workforce. Studies show that compliance tips are often best digested by the workforce when they're in small bits. So if you have a compliance corner in your newsletter or intranet, it's great to sprinkle compliance reminders throughout the year. Don't just leave HIPAA training under the privacy rule for an annual training. Obviously, when people are hired, they need to be trained. All of those things should be documented. So the compliance corner in your newsletter, the annual training, the initial training, documentation is really, really important to be able to demonstrate to the government that you are taking the law seriously. I also just wanted to mention one of the things that we frequently do is to give a presentation at least annually to the board of directors or trustees. Compliance is really a culture, and it starts from the top down. And so it's important for the privacy and security officers to remind the leadership of an organization how important this law is and what the current enforcement environment is, why this matters from a business perspective, that the organization is compliant. And so, top 10 things you can do to present your organization from a violation of the HIPAA privacy and securities rules. It's 10 minutes well spent at a board of directors meeting, and we can always help with that. And I know that Andy's team does some great tabletop exercises, and it's less costly to address these issues on the front end to mitigate risk than to address them on the back end. And Brandon can tell you a lot more about that. The other thing, just from a practical perspective, I wanted to mention in connection with the privacy rule relates to business associate agreements. Clearly, they're the most boring agreements and no one likes reading them, but it's very, very important that those who are entering the business associate agreements, whether you're a covered entity and you're requiring them of your vendors, or whether you're a software company or management company entering them with a covered entity, it's important to actually look at what they say, because the regulations require that certain elements be present in those business associate agreements, but then oftentimes additional provisions are added. So if you're a business associate, you want to make sure that your business associate agreement is simple and stripped down. If you're a covered entity, you might want to include robust indemnification and insurance provisions. The insurance should match with what's actually in place. Sometimes people don't take time to look at that. The other thing that I'll just mention is sometimes the indemnification provisions are extremely overbroad. So if you're a business associate, you shouldn't be serving as an insurance policy for a covered entity. You should be responsible for what's within your control, what's with, something, an event that's your fault, or something that you've done wrong. And so it's important to take a look at those. So I guess that's all I'll say for now. We can kind of move on. Andy, do you want to cover tips from a security expert?
Absolutely. So as I said, we do quite a bit of healthcare organizations, and if I can paraphrase slightly, in the cyber world, an ounce of prevention, Kate, building on what you said, an ounce of prevention is worth about 5 tons of cure. It is far, far, far more expensive to clean these things up when they're not done correctly at the beginning than it is to just to correct them from the beginning. But we pared our list down to about 8 items, although there was another 2 or 3 that were questionable. Probably these are frankly in no particular order, but one of the more important ones is this idea of a multi-factor authentication solution. Most organizations that we meet with today either do not use multi-factor or only partially using multi-factor authentication. For those of you not familiar with multi-factor, it's that idea of if I log into a website, something texts me a number that I got to put in. That's a basic form of multi-factor authentication, but it's something that allows your organization's IT infrastructure to confirm that the person that says they're Kate logging in from Uzbekistan is actually Kate, and it is legitimate. So multi-factor authentication for all. If you're tired of really complex usernames and passwords, which typically the organizations we deal with like to try to implement very complex usernames and password standards, Doctors tend to love really complex passwords because they have to change them every 60 days or so. Love being a very facetious way of saying it. We would encourage you to put some sort of multi-factor in. It'll help you reduce the onerous burden of really complex passwords, because my password doesn't have to be as complex if I have multi-factor, if I have some other way of proving I am who I say I am. The second one is this idea of some sort of managed detection and response and threat hunting. So for those of you that have been around IT for a while, it used to be that we used technology that we called antivirus. Antivirus still exists. It's still a tool that's out there. We as an organization moved away from that a few years ago as a primary tool to help prevent the spread of computer viruses or computer malware. The primary reason is it's a dated technology. It's signature based. I won't go into all that. We use a tool set today that is artificial intelligence based, and it uses heuristics, which heuristics is a really fancy way of saying it learns behavior. So Kate, if I'll use you as example again, I apologize, but maybe Kate is logging in from Uzbekistan, and it is Kate because she has both her username and password as well as this multiple factor of authentication. So it is really Kate, but now we're questioning the thought of, well, why is Kate logging in from Uzbekistan, and is that a normal behavior for her? And if it's not, we can shut that down in real time. So this idea of a managed detection and response will look for those odd behaviors and single them out in real time. And it literally is doing millions of calculations a second. The third is this idea of some sort of high efficacy patching service. This is kind of a no-brainer, but if I told you the number of organizations that are significantly undermanaged here, I don't know that you would necessarily believe me. Everyone on this phone call, this bridge probably has a computer at home. You probably get those pop-ups about Windows or Mac wanting to do an update on the operating system. If you're like most people, you kind of ignore it and you go, you know what, I want to surf the web right now, or I want to finish watching my movie, or I want to do whatever I want to do except applying those patches. An unpatched computer, an unpatched application that runs on the computer, so you can think the Office suite or an Adobe application, or an unpatched application that is in-house or homegrown, those are the #1 vector for how quickly things spread. Since we're all in healthcare, without hopefully this becoming a political statement, I think the idea of everybody receiving a vaccination is a good idea because it helps with this overall idea of herd immunity. What we usually find is organizations typically do not have patching, and if they do have patching, they don't have it in a very complete fashion. And when the piece of malware finds its way into the environment, it doesn't require the human interaction and contact like what we see typically for viruses to transmit in human populations. Once one machine becomes infected, it can communicate with everything on the network in fractions of a second, and they all become infected. We had a healthcare client, it's been about 2 years, just over 2 years ago now, that they had someone click on a piece of malware in their human resources department at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. And by 7:39 on that Tuesday morning, 97% of their environment was encrypted and ransomed because it was all missing a patch that had been available for about 7 years. So the hospital system cratered and was unable to perform any services for the better part of 10 to 14 days. But patching is very important. This idea of backups, if you're in a leadership role or you have the ability to influence your leadership policy, there's this idea of air gap backups and immutable backups. And I won't go into all the gory details here, but the idea of an immutable backup is a protected backup that is incapable of being ransomed or corrupted or encrypted. If I told you the number of times in the last, especially the last 3 years, we've seen organizations that have suffered an attack, and their IT organization will come in because they're not necessarily cyber experts. They'll come in and they'll bring the backups online to start the restoration, only to have the backups encrypted and taking away their last line of defense. It's a pretty disheartening, the impact of that. So some sort of immutable backup offline. Both Kate and Brandon have already talked about this, but the worst possible time to be developing an incident response plan is when you are in the middle of an incident response. These are extremely high stress environments. Patients are not being able to be serviced. Doctors are very upset. Board members are usually very vocal. As a result, the last thing you want to be doing is trying to figure this one out as you go. Having, we refer to them as a WISP, a written information security plan. Having a WISP documented and tested and tried is the time to do it. It reminds me a lot of the late 70s and early 80s when we would see on those public services announcements of having a plan. If you have a fire in your home, what is your plan? Who's going to grab what? How do you exit the building? Where do you meet? What do you take with you, etc. Do not wait until the fire starts to do this. We highly, strongly advocate these tabletop exercises for these simulations, because it's very eye-opening about what you're able to do well and what you're not able to do well. Install some sort of data encryption service. Most organizations are doing better at this today. Most operating systems, such as Windows or Mac OS or Linux for that matter, will include some type of encryption software with it. That is helpful to protect. In the industry, we refer to that as data at rest. So as long as that data is not being accessed, it's encrypted and protected. The data is no longer protected when somebody's looking at it. So if I'm logged in and I have access to that data, even if it's encrypted, it's not protected. Somebody could exfiltrate that using my identity. We talked about training of associates. I'll give you some industry averages. The best in class that we've seen for training, where you probably get a lot of that don't click emails exercise. The best in class, those organizations that train their associates to be the best at not clicking. In the US, the best in class is still about a 4% click rate. That's best in class. The national average is about 8%. So about 8% of the emails that you get through that shouldn't be clicked on are still getting clicked on, which you can imagine what that does. And then the last one, we built a public service website about a year or so ago. We call it ransomwareclock.org. It's a wonderful resource for you to collect information or study up on what a ransomware attack looks like, what one of these incidents looks like, how to protect your organization, how to get outside resource and help. There's some great information there about how to contact the FBI, CISA, and organizations like ourselves to be able to come and either protect you from these bad things happening or clean them up when they do. So that's what I got, Kate. Brandon, I think you're up next.
Yes, thank you, Andy. So as far as considerations for incident responses, Andy touched on, as Kate touched on, you have to be prepared. And a successful incident response doesn't start when there's an incident. It starts months and years prior to that by instilling good policies, good procedures, good training for your folks. So an incident response plan looks, as I look at it, it's more the technical side. What are we doing to address this incident? The disaster recovery plan maybe skews more on the business side. How do we bring back up our operations so that we can continue in a healthcare setting serving patients? HIPAA requires written policies and procedures, but as Kate said, it's a minimum floor. HIPAA is not a security framework. So when you are drafting your policies, they really should be tailored to your organization. They shouldn't be, you shouldn't pull from the HHS website the suggested policies and procedures, because it's a baseline, but they may not be tailored to your specific needs as an organization. And as Andy noted, the hackers today, or I guess let me call them the threat actors today, they're not all looking like the Unabomber sketch with a hoodie and sunglasses on, sitting behind a computer. They may be Jane Doe, HR associate who is overworked, tired, and doesn't utilize the proper hygiene when it comes to the security threats and her responsibility for maintaining the systems. So the policies and procedures, they are not only, they're not targeted only at outside threat actors who are trying to deploy ransomware in your organization. They also need to be tailored to the insiders, as you may have heard us speak on prior. Insiders are those employees and associates that work for your organization. Sure, some insider threats may be intentional. It may be somebody who has an axe to grind with your organization and sells access to your systems. But it also may be an overworked individual. And what the policies and procedures can do, it can just develop layers to find that out, have access controls, have password controls. Everybody has to change their password every 3 to 4 months. Everybody has to use special characters and a combination of letters and numbers and capitalized. All of those should be drafted and reduced to written policies. Part of that is to maintain continuity. You want to ensure if there's a new CTO that comes in, that the organization's IT world isn't turned on its head because nobody knows any of the historical information or there's no continuity. So that's one focus of the policies. But then let's move, once there is an incident, these incidents cause shock and chaos in your organizations. There are also a bunch of competing interests in addressing these incidents. You have IT interests trying to maintain the existing IT framework. You have business interests trying to maintain revenue. You have the PR interests in trying to maintain the messaging that's going out to the consumers and the public. These incident response plans and these disaster recovery plans, what they do is they bring a little bit of a little semblance of normalcy in the face of chaos. If you're dealing with an outside threat, and as Andy said, some of these threat actors are patient. They get in your systems and they wait weeks or months to deploy whatever they're going to deploy to disrupt you. In looking at that, they wait for important events in your business, whether it be a merger or an acquisition. They try and cause chaos at these, very high stress moments in your organization, because that's the time that mistakes are more likely to be made. As far as point number 2, for involving the attorney to maintain privilege and coordinate vendor support, different types of incidents require different types of responses. So as Andy and Kate touched on with tabletop exercises, not all tabletop exercises are designed to address the same issue. They are designed to address different types of issues. So say in the event of ransomware, you not only have either your internal or external IT group trying to coordinate their actions, you also have your public relations team. Say that the news organization gets wind of it and starts calling to figure out what information they can glean from the incident. You also have the hackers that are sending encrypted emails looking for 5, 10, 25 Bitcoin to release your information. And all of that requires some sort of coordination. And with an attorney involved in this, and you may have heard the terminology incident coach or breach coach, what their job is to coordinate all of these different stakeholders and all of these different vendors, whether it be forensics, whether it be somebody who specializes in coordinating ransom payments, whether it be a PR team to manage the PR implications and the messaging to the public. And by having an attorney involved, it can be coordinated so that there are certain preservations that are maintained. And Kyle will actually touch on that on the next slide as far as attorney-client privilege and work product. And then finally, you want to be swift, but you also want to be measured. From a technical perspective, I think, Andy, you'll probably say speed is, probably the most significant weapon you can use to combat. You need to get in there and you need to preserve the systems, and you need to limit the spread of whatever malware or whatever's been deployed in your systems. From an attorney side, sometimes you need to, from a reporting aspect, from a messaging aspect, from a communications with regulators, whether it be healthcare regulators or the FBI, you also want to make sure that you're measured in what you are disclosing, and that you understand the full details and the full facts before you offer something up, because it can be very stressful and can cause unintended and further consequences when you have to walk things back, or you have to redo what you have already disclosed as being maybe the extent of the incident. So being quick on an IT side, certainly, but you also want to be measured to ensure that you're understanding what data is implicated, what your reporting obligations are, and who you should be communicating with, whether that be federal regulators or state regulators or the FBI or other law enforcement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks, Brandon. Hello, everyone. Kyle Johnson. I'm a commercial litigator with Brennan, Mann & Diamond. I handle a variety of complex disputes in state and federal courts, and I tell my clients all the time, my job is to keep you out of court as much as to protect you in court. So I've worked with Brandon and Kate to sort of develop our cyber practice, really to focus on compliance on the front end, and of course, working with Andy and his team at Fortress to come up with practical solutions to avoid claims and to avoid breach incidents, but also be prepared when these types of incidents come up. So I often get the question, well, what type of claims can arise from a breach incident? Well, they're varied. First, it depends on how the breach occurred. If you have a third party you're working with and they are breached, it could compromise your system. And so when we talk about being proactive on the front end, making sure the contracts that you sign with vendors, making sure the contracts you sign with subcontractors, to make sure that they have cyber protections and cyber policies in place to protect you. But what happens if something happens? Well, you may have claims against them. You may need to look towards their insurance company. So there's a lot of ways in which litigation can come up. For example, there's a case pending in the Western District of Texas involving a company that was serving as a prescription benefits manager for Rite Aid. Well, it released 2.5 million patient records in a breach response. And I'm sure Rite Aid's looking at them going, come on, guys, what's going on here? So in that lawsuit, it's a class action brought by those 2.5 million patients. And I'm sure CaptureRx, the pharmacy benefits manager, they're taking the lead on that. So, you can be exposed if you cause a larger entity to some of these issues. So, those types of claims come up. Another big claim in the healthcare space are class actions involving patients. The defense bar has been very successful as of late, including most recently in last fall before the Supreme Court, challenging data breach class actions. The defense bar has argued that a breach on its own is not sufficient to give a person standing to file a lawsuit, including to be a class member. But in the healthcare space specifically, as Andy said, PHI is 20 times more valuable than financial information. So it's easier to get over that initial bar of standing, and it's easier for plaintiffs' lawyers to come after healthcare entities for class actions. And so if a breach event occurs, litigation counsel should be brought in as part of response, because it's not only putting your system back in place, but you have to expect and anticipate the potential for legal claims. And that can take many forms, but certainly if patient health data is released, there's going to be problems, and there could be potential class action problems. And so hiring litigation counsel and getting them involved early, incredibly important, along with your breach coach, along with your technical advisors, Andy and his team. Another area where you can get into some of these issues deals with your own insurance company. Everybody wants to say, well, I've got cyber coverage. Well, what does cyber coverage actually cover? And when you get into these situations, when there's big dollars at stake, I can tell you insurance companies don't like writing checks. And as any of our healthcare clients know, in dealing with insurance companies during the pandemic with business interruption losses, you can run into the same issue in a cyber event where you're fighting just as much with your own insurance company on losses as you are with others. And so you need to be cognizant of what your insurance policies provide, what sort of benefits. You need to audit those policies. You need to make sure that where appropriate, you're named as an additional insured on a subcontractor to make sure that you're protected. One of the issues that is really coming up now is cyber exclusions, including in directors and officers or professional liability policies. Healthcare business owners are exposed to this. If you are an owner of a business and there's a potential issue and you have other owners of the business in a privately held entity, or you're a public entity, there could be claims and derivative actions brought against you. And whether those claims are actually covered and protected by insurance based on exclusions following a cyber event is a big deal. And so I would encourage everyone to meet with their brokers and to bring them to the table and make sure you have a very complete understanding of not only your cyber policy, but how it interacts with other aspects of your policy, including directors and officers insurance. And of course, you may get into litigation with your carriers on the back end of these. I mean, obviously the breach is the main event. It's the Super Bowl. Litigation is like the cleanup afterwards. Who's paying the bill? Who's cleaning this up? And it's the issues that linger for 12 months, 24 months, who knows, 36 months after a breach event. And so it becomes the focus, long after the breach event. And finally, Brandon hinted on this, and it's important to bring in attorneys for privilege and work product concerns during a breach response. But most important, you need to develop protocols for how you report, how you communicate internally, who's doing the investigation. What you don't want is you don't want all of your employees putting together timelines. You don't want them investigating on their own and coming up with conclusions. The vendors you use, the technical service providers like Andy and his team, how they coordinate with the lawyers becomes very important when you get into a litigation situation, because there are courts that have held cyber incident response reports of what happened and what occurred are not privileged, because oftentimes they say, well, that's not attorney-client work product. The attorney didn't put that together. That was something that the business did. You also run into privilege issues. What is privileged? What is not privileged? Is this truly attorney-client communication? And these are very fact-specific issues that come up, and how you report to OCR. How do you report to the new agencies that are developing, policies and procedures that you may work with in each of your businesses? These are really important considerations. So if I can leave you with anything, it's that you need to have good quality counsel considering and looking into sort of the back end issues. It's not as simple as just saying, well, everything's privileged, everything's protected, because it may not be. The federal rules of civil procedure, they allow work product, for instance, to be turned over to the other side if they have no way of gathering that information. Well, why does that apply in a cyber incident? Well, all of the information regarding that cyber incident is usually housed within the company that's probably being sued. And so courts are going to be more lenient as we move into the future with what can be protected by just claiming work product and privilege. So there are a tremendous number of litigation risks in cyber issues. The best defense is a good offense. Be proactive on the front end. Work with folks like Brandon and Kate and Andy, and really develop the policies and training to avoid the situation. But when an event happens, there needs to be a serious consideration about the potential claims in the future and how to manage those claims, because they could be bet the company depending on the scope of the breach.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was really, it's always nice for me to hear from another perspective. I mean, I just kind of work on the front end when everything's happy and harmonious. And it's always good to hear the practical guidance from you and Andy and Brandon. So with that, I mean, we have about 10 minutes left of our allotted time, and this group would be happy to answer questions if any of the attendees have some for short Q&A period. So feel free to just let us know if you have a question. And if not, that's okay too. Do any of the panelists have questions for each other, or I'm just curious. Andy, I'd love to learn more about your tabletop exercises and how long those typically take and what's involved in preparing for them.
So thanks, Kate. I would say we generally like to offer our tabletop exercises as part of we have a service we call CyBAS, Cybersecurity as a Service. It's kind of an annual subscription, and we usually try to do one tabletop per quarter. And the tabletop could be everything from just your good old fashioned run of the mill ransomware demand note. Or it could be all the way through nation state sponsored cyber terrorism. So I'm sure you've seen some of the data coming out recently, but the FBI reported last year that the current estimate is that China stole about $600 billion in intellectual property from the US last year. And it's been that way for the last couple of years. It was a little lower the year before, but we'll do tabletop exercises that focus on kind of those themes. It could be that somebody in your human resources department accidentally clicked on a link. It could be that this is healthcare, but it could be in manufacturing. Someone's there trying to steal your trade secrets or your IP. It could be insider threat. Someone in your organization left and on their way out decided to compromise the integrity of your network. Which those are always fun exercises. The first example is, oh, well, when that person quit, we're going to know that we have a record when they left. Well, that's true, but you're making the assumption that the bad actors, the threat actors, are actually attacking the second the person leaves. Nope. All they want them to do is open the door and allow somebody in, and then they plant their little malware around the network, and your associate's been gone 6 or 8 months and they've already cashed their check. You'll have dozens or hundreds of associates that have left in that time frame, and it's a very hard crime to be able to go back and prove without the appropriate tools, so to speak. But they're usually a typical tabletop exercise will last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. It usually involves business leadership, IT leadership. Depending on the size of the organization, it'll usually involve risk. Anybody in the organization is responsible for risk. Anybody that would be responsible for crisis communication. And then we usually involve the corresponding entities outside. So organizations like BMD, organizations that help manage crisis communication. As we said before, the last time to be learning these muscle memories is while you're doing them. You should be able to, it's not a function of if, but when you're attacked, here's the playbook we're following. We've all agreed to it. We all know our roles and responsibilities. We know who we're communicating with. We know what we're communicating. Kind of going back to, I guess that was probably Kyle's comment, if I remember correctly. We strongly prefer to work in partnership with either ideally your outside counsel, but possibly your in-house counsel. We want you to, as an organization, have the protection and privilege, as well as we would like to be able to control who we have to talk to. As you can imagine, some of the things that we may uncover during a digital forensics exercise, it may be mandatory or compulsory reporting for us, like child pornography, as a for instance. So it's always good to have privilege to work behind.
Hey, when I'm talking, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so I was just going to jump on that, Kate. To Andy's point, I mean, you really can't control sort of how these things get looked at or evaluated in the back end. So coming up with, you know, reporting protocols and sort of communication protocols, almost like a PR firm, you know, how we're going to communicate and who we're going to communicate with is really important. And in smaller organizations, that's probably not hard to do, because the leadership is who needs to hear it, and they're already coordinating a lot of these things, and it's very simple. In much larger organizations, if left hand is not speaking to right hand, you can have these problems, and you can, what the courts would look at on the back end, especially if it's something that, you know, you don't want to be made public or come out in a litigation. You know, if it's certain like an ordinary report, an attorney just can't slap on privilege just because, you know, it was prepared by the company. I mean, it has to be made at the attorney's direction. It has to be made in conjunction with an attorney's investigation for anticipated litigation, or at least with respect to privilege, it has to be made in a communication by a lawyer. So there's very specific issues that need to be contended with.
Kyle, if I could, I'll just build on that. I'm sure most of you saw the news recently. It was in the Plain Dealer and in Cranes, I think last week before last. And it was Parker Hannafin had announced that they had an incident, will qualify it as an incident back, I think it was March 13th, when the incident occurred. I will tell you, not because we do business with Parker, I will tell you that because of social media, don't be surprised inside your organization if your own associates are communicating on social media about problems you're having internally with your IT, whether it was an attack or ransomware or encryption or what have you. The narrative is going to leave your four walls. It's just a function of who's controlling it and who's communicating what, and how much of that's going to be discoverable down the road, and then it gets messy.
Okay, I think I just want to thank everyone for joining the call, and for my co-presenters for participating today. And I think with that, we're probably, our time is up today, but please feel free to reach out to any of us with any follow-up questions, you know, casually offline. We're always happy to brainstorm and issue spot. These are topics that we really enjoy working on. So
thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
bye-bye.